Aló. Buenos días, muy buenos días a todas, a todos, compañeras, compañeros. Bueno, hoy es 3 de octubre y hoy es, hoy es 4 de octubre, Día del Cordonazo, pero es otra cosa además del Día del Cordonazo, que es importante recordar hoy. Hoy 4 de octubre, hace 11 años, creo que casi todos y todas los que estamos acá estuvimos en la Avenida Bolívar para el cierre de campaña del comandante Chávez. Un evento inolvidable, de verdad. Ayer justo estuvimos con Rebeca en el cuartel de la montaña y entre otras cosas vimos las fotos de esa concentración en donde llenamos 7 avenidas. Entonces hoy es un día bonito para recordar eso, porque fue un momento histórico, fue un momento de mucha alegría y de mucha fuerza y de mucha convicción por algo en lo que tenemos que afianzar esa convicción. Tenemos que seguir ese camino.
So we must continue moving on that
Comandante Chávez para construir un mundo mejor,
path to build
que es lo que tenemos
a new world.
que proponernos, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, bienvenido y bienvenida hoy 4
So
de octubre,
welcome
día del Papa
today
Francisco.
on October the 4th, the
No
day
sabemos si
of
nos caerá el cordonazo hoy.
Saint Francis. We don't know if we will have
Pero
the
si nos cae el
Cordonazo
cordonazo, vamos a
today,
tomarlo como lo tomó el comandante ese día.
but in that case, let's
Es
take
un
it
cordonazo que
as
nos da
the commander did
fuerza
that
y...
day because it will give us strength to continue moving forward.
Okay. Chula. Después nos hablas de eso. Bueno, estamos en el tercer seminario internacional sobre
Today we
reparaciones
are
contra
in
la
the
esclavitud y la
third
colonización.
international seminar on
Nuestro segundo
reparations
día de clases
of
con nuestra amiga
slavery and
y
colonization. This is
compañera
our
Rebeca
second
Igreja de
session
la Universidad de
day of
Brasilia.
classes with Rebeca Igreja
Quería
from the
hacer
University of Brasilia.
un
And I wanted
recordatorio
to make an
porque
announcement.
el Centro de Estudio de Transformaciones Sociales del IBI
The
ha
study of
organizado
social
para este mes
transformation from IBIC has
una serie de
organized
encuentros
for this month a
diálogos
series of
y debates
dialogues
sobre asuntos
and
coloniales.
debates
Cada
on
día 3
decolonial
de octubre va a haber uno de estos encuentros
matters.
en la tarde, a las 2 de la tarde,
We will
en la
have an
Galería Nacional.
encounter on the
Este mes
evening
comienza
in
este
the
lunes.
National Art Gallery. The first one will
El
start
lunes a las
this
2 en
Friday
Sagán.
at 2 p.m.
Se llama Diálogos Decoloniales.
It will be the colonial
José
dialogues,
Romero Lozaco,
and
nuestro
we will
amigo,
have a guest, Jose
profesor
Romero
acá,
Prosaco, our friend
para hablar de ciencia y
that's
conocimiento.
here with us to talk about
Entonces hago
science and
esa publicidad
knowledge.
hoy. Pero bueno, hoy seguimos entonces con
And today we will
nuestro seminario.
continue with our
Siguiendo con el
seminar
tema
with
el gran
Rebecca.
debate que venía trayendo desde ayer.
We'll
Quizás quieres
continue with the debate
decir algo.
we had yesterday.
Buenos
I don't know
días.
if Asamar would like to say
Agradecerles a todos y a
something.
todos la
Yes,
presencia
good
una
morning. I
vez
would like
más,
to thank
igualmente a
you
las
for
personas que se
being
encuentran
here
conectadas por vía
today.
virtual.
Also, the
El día de
people
ayer
that
en el
are
debate de
connected
discusión
via
sobre
Zoom.
políticas
Yesterday, on the
multiculturales
framework, when we were talking
internacionales,
about
tuvimos la
multicultural
revisión
policies
de lo que
and
fue
social
la historia
and
política
racial
de Brasil
equality, we were reviewing the political
frente a
history of
el
Brazil
proceso de colonización en ese
and
país.
the
Vimos cómo Brasil es un país
characteristics of the
pluricultural de
colonization
identidad
process in this country.
nacional,
We saw
como
that their
resultado del proceso
national
de
identity
esclavismo.
have been
Conversamos
constituted
también sobre cómo el proceso de
around slave
esclavización se basó en
trade.
una
We also
represión
saw how
y cómo
it
los
was
grupos de
based
poder
on the
en
plantation
durante esa
system
plantación se
and the power
sostenían
groups
históricamente,
that
mantenían el
created
poder
this system
social
have
y material de la
maintained
presencia,
in power
cómo se ha instaurado una
until
política de
today, how
blanqueamiento
a
desde la
whitening
democracia
policy has
racial
been
que ha
instaured from racial
utilizado la
democracy that has
raza
used
y
the
el
fostering
discurso
of
de
miscegenation
segregación
and the discourse
para
of integration
invisibilizarse
as a
y para
way to make these policies invisible, which are racist, and wants to um, install racial superiority. Today, we will continue deepening on these topics along with Rebecca, who we are going to welcome again. Please turn off your cell phones. We have a broadcast on YouTube, and we also have simultaneous interpretation in English, Spanish, and French. So without any further ado, welcome Rebecca, you have the floor. Well, thank you once again, and thank you for inviting me. It is a pleasure for me to be here. Can you hear me? What about now? Can you hear me now? Well, I think I am closer. I will eat the microphone. Yes, I think it's better now. I would like to tell you that I made some changes because I think we must explain some aspects. I was talking to Guillermo when we are here in this space. I like to talk about contradictions and discussing historical specific context and how we choose the theories and how we manage these matters. The racial matter in Brazil is very complex and it is part of social sciences studies. There's a long history of studies regarding the Black population in Brazil, mainly because it is closely linked to the building of national identity in Brazil. How the Black population is a majority in the country and very diverse. There are huge regional differences in Brazil, which allow us to think about the Black culture in America. There's a book called um, Black Culture Without Ethnicity. So how do we build this concept of the Black community when compared to the specific aspects of the Brazilian context, which is unique in the movement, how the Brazilian population is distributed? And as I said yesterday, Brazil has always been a model in the world regarding these issues, since we are the country with the biggest African population, Black African population outside Africa. And it is called the racial paradise, but then the racial hell, and it is the result of its own history and how it lives its own history, considering it is always being judged by this model of a society with such a high number of Black population. So this shows how a country that has received the largest amount of slaves and how it today has such a settled society, and the majority of the population that's exploited is Black. And in order to start today's discussion, I wanted to show you the map of Brazil. So you can understand what I'm talking about regarding the colonization process. We're talking about 8.5 million kilometers, which a huge territorial diversity, culturally. And as I had explained, the Portuguese had a very singular colonization with a practice they had already done in Africa. So the Portuguese arrived with a colonizing practice that was homogeneous, and it has been able to impose Portuguese as the national language, impose Catholicism as a national religion. Brazil was the most Catholic country in the world, with over 90% of the population being Catholic until evangelical religion arrived. And you're not going to see in this territorial dimension, when I talk about it, the demographic census, that it is very interesting to see the categories that are used in the census and how it reflects this colonization. I really like to work with demographic census because the way in which it categorizes the population says a lot about the politics of a state, how the people is distributed. And in demographic institutes, they do a deep work of how they collect information, how they classify that information. After I work about census, it will be very clear how the population is distributed in Brazil. As you can see in Brazil, the Amazonian region is, I think, a third of the territory of Brazil. We have the states of Amazonas, Pará, the states in the north. So a great part of the territory is made up of the Amazonian region, and it is mainly in the northern states that are next to, for example, Roraima. Then we have Mato Grosso, which is jungle. Uh, these are the regions that are filled with water in a specific period of the year, the marshland. This is the marshland. And in Mato Grosso, we have the Xingu Park, which is an indigenous area. So this, we called this area the marshland. And between Golas and Mato Grosso, there's another part, another type of jungle, which is the savanna. We have a very dry climate with clear periods of rain and drought. Then in the northeast, with Maranhão, it is a state that has a lot of indigenous people. It used to be considered part of the Amazonian region in the northwest, but today it is known as the northeast until up to Bahia, which had a great population when the Portuguese arrived, and it was decimated by the Portuguese. However, This is not recognized as an indigenous region with what it is called caboclo because there was a high level of mix with the indigenous people and the white. We have a strong presence of African religion, the candomblé in Bahia. Maranhão also has a different religion that's similar to candomblé. And this northeast region, in the rest, in the other states, we have a prevalence of Catholicism. Then in the rest of the states, in Calagoas and surrounding states, we have a desert area, which is the poorest area in the country. We had a drought of over 5 years. Many people died and they moved to Sao Paulo, the internal migration we were talking about yesterday. And when the military were settled in the Amazonian region, they took landowners from the south, which is part of the agro business, and they took workers from the northeast that were escaping the drought that became the workers of the Amazonian region. So they are people that are polluting the area, that are committing crimes, and that are also exploited. But they are also people that are living the desert without any job, hungry, and they are taken to work to the Amazonian region. And the Garimpo, along with the people in the south, are the ones controlling this area. The military also tried to build a road that would go through the whole Amazonian region. And until the 80s, Brazil was fostering policies of space settlement because this region, this Amazonian region, is scarcely populated. It has a big indigenous population, but it has a lower Prieta or Preto population, and I will explain that in a few minutes. And then we have the river and the mining areas. In the southeast, we have Goiás, which was in the middle of the country, and they had the idea of having a settlement in this area in the 60s and 70s. We were populating the country. All of this area of Cerrado in Brazil. And there are quilombos there in Goiás, in Bahia, in Minas. These have many quilombos in this area. In the southeast, we have Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Espírito Santo, which is the most industrialized area of the country with the largest amount of population, with the metropolitan area. Rio has around 14 million, Sao Paulo around 18 million inhabitants. I don't remember the figures exactly, but these are the two biggest urban areas in Brazil. Rio and Sao Paulo have two very different cultures with a strong Black presence. Rio is the land in which Umbanda, a different religion we were talking about yesterday, has developed, and all the stereotypes related to Rio, music, and all of that.
So this changes a lot the country. When we talk about the carnival that you know in general is the Carnival of Rio, which you are not going to find in Bahia, in Pernambuco. Pernambuco has a carnival that is very typical and is well known. There are so many people that go to the streets. It's the most famous carnival in Brazil, but the foreigners know very little about it. And when they reach to the Amazonian region, we have another type of music. It's something different. And when you get to the Sierra, Pernambuco, well, not Pernambuco, but if you get to Paraíba or to all these states, there we have parties that mixes ancient cultures, traditional cultures, Catholic cultures, and other type of musics that are related to the desertic areas. And Rio has that format. Now, Sao Paulo is another world because Sao Paulo was a zone that received a lot of migration in Brazil. It is a zone that produces coffee. It is a very important zone for the country that was developed by migrants. It receives a lot of migrants from the Northeast, but also international migrants. There's a lot of presence of people from Syria and Lebanon and from Italy. Minas Gerais is the zone which is the highest producer of milk in the country. The whole industry of dairy products is located there. Minas Gerais is the largest producer of precious stones in Brazil and iron. There is a mineral exploitation that is very strong there, and it was during the colonization a great producer of gold in Brazil. There was a cycle of gold. That is what it was called in the country. It is a state that is quite traditional, and for many years, the national policies was in the hands either of politicians of Rio, of Minas, or of Sao Paulo. They controlled the country for years with a very particular culture. Rio was the capital of Brazil. The Portuguese arrived in Bahia, in Porto Seguro. Then Salvador was the capital. But afterwards, the capital was Rio. And after Rio, the capital was Brasilia. All that part of the north and east of Brazil did not exist, so as to say, for politicians. And the military servicemen during the dictatorship that applied this policy of occupation. But from Sao Paulo in the 19th century, they created what it was called the Bandeirantes, which were people who simply persecuted indigenous people to occupy the country. And in Sao Paulo, there are museums that show the glorification of the Bandeirantes. It was equivalent to the United States with the occupation of the West. What they did was to occupy the country and delimit the borders that we know. Nowadays, there is a very strong historical revision of the role of the Bandeirantes of this process. Because more than an indigenous massacre, there was already a massacre during the colonization and also when we had the occupation of the Bandeirantes in the country. Then we go to the south part of the country, Paraná, Santa Catarina, and Rio Grande do Sul is the coldest zone of the area. These three states, they have snow, they are very cold. They're very different from the rest of the country from a weather point of view. We have a zone of jungle, a desertic zone, and also a cold zone from Sao Paulo downwards. And then you get to Santa Catarina, and there we have low temperatures, below zero. Those are very cold states with a large presence of migration from Europe. We have lots of people from Croatia, Russia, Polish, Germany, Italy that arrived at that region, and the Black population is lower. I don't have to tell you that there are severe problems of racism in that area. It is an area that received, unfortunately, many Nazists that escaped the war and that went to Brazil. Nazists that were quite known from Germany. So it is a zone with a large European migration that even though we had this plan of unification of the country, they stayed there. They applied their traditions there. There are cities like Blumenau, which we think that we are in Germany because its architecture is very different. But for example, the capital of Pernambuco during the colonization was invaded by the Dutch, who stayed there for many years. Saint Louis, the capital, is Maranhão. It was founded by the French people, by an invasion of French people who stayed there for a long time. The French people also tried to invade Rio de Janeiro during the colonization era. And why am I talking about this? It is to show you how complex it is when we talk about half of the population and we say that the half of the population is Black, is that up until that half of the population live different realities. They are situated in very different contexts, cultural contexts that are quite different. And besides, even though there are many Africans who have arrived, the Portuguese, as I said before, sent this population to different areas of the country. They displaced them in order not to have the same ethnias in the same places together. So when we study the data of the Black population in Brazil, you must be aware of the fact of this regional diversity that exists. And what unifies us, because what we did in the project, in this political project of the Black movement in Brazil, was to study the situation of exploitation, racism, and discrimination. This is why the political stance of the Black movement in Brazil historically has been the fight against discrimination and racism. They created a cultural community, a Black community in the country, which has been very difficult due to the diversity that we have. I'm going to show you how we define the Black community in Brazil based on the interpretation of several politicians and Black intellectuals in the country. Do you have any question? Can I continue? Okay. Can we now go to the next slide?
Bueno, esto era para completar lo que ya habíamos hablado de la trata, ¿no? Justo para nuevamente reforzar. En América Latina, el cálculo que ha llegado más de 10 millones de personas esclavizadas, y ustedes imaginan que solo en Brasil ha llegado 5 millones. Y había incluso una comunicación entre Brasil y Estados Unidos y Florida de envio e intercâmbio de escravizados na época da esclavitud. Então, era uma comunicação que já existia nesta época do tráfico de chegava em Brasil, de los que se encaminhava aos Estados Unidos, de lo que regressava a Brasil. Então, isso é bem importante ter em conta da dimensão de que foi a trata em Brasil, realmente em grande proporção. E como eu disse, reemplazar os esclavizados era algo muito rápido, o próprio comércio. O que ensina também esta violência da esclavitud. O sea, Brasil sempre nos ensinava na escola uma história, uma ideia que a esclavitud em Brasil havia sido mais blanda, menos violenta que a esclavitud em Estados Unidos devido ao mestizaje, os espaços de convivência, tal e tal. Pero la verdad que la expectativa de vida de los esclavizados, reemplazar a ellos todo el tiempo con una trata muy intensa en el país, demuestra que finalmente esta menos violencia no se sustenta, porque finalmente la gente moría trabajando como esclavizada. Y por esta dimensión. seguimos, y más como yo había dicho de usted. Ahí es cuando yo hablé de la democracia racial y les había apuntado que toda la discusión del movimiento negro era una discusión por la integración del negro en la sociedad brasileña. Esta ha sido la temática que es muy importante. Como yo dije, la impresión que uno tiene, y Lula repite mucho eso, que el Brasil siempre parece un país complejado, y Lula dice que nosotros tenemos el complejo de vira-lata. ¿Qué es un vira-lata? Los perros callejeros, que nos ponemos frente al mundo siempre como este sujeto que es el no ser. No encajamos en ninguna de las situaciones y siempre tenemos vergüenza de cómo nos presentamos frente al mundo. Y nuevamente, de repente, cuando vino las teorías racistas, Brasil era el peor ejemplo porque había dejado mestizar, la mezcla entre las razas. Y después, cuando viene el multiculturalismo, nuevamente el problema es que dejamos mestizar. Necesitamos salir de la discusión de la mezcla y empezar a reconocer las diferencias. O sea, vienen los cambios de concepción y Brasil nuevamente se encaja. Como hay muchos estudios en este momento sobre el mestizaje. ¿Por qué? El mestizaje, en cuanto a herramienta política, siempre fue un mecanismo de invisibilización del racismo muy fuerte. Pero es un hecho. Y no significa que tener muchos matrimonios interraciales no existe racismo. Al contrario, puede estar casada con un negro, una persona, una mujer negra, y seguir siendo racista. Entonces, todas esas teorías, como dicen los estudios de Estados Unidos, que el matrimonio interracial cambia el racismo, no, porque el racismo está mucho más vinculado a las representaciones sociales. Y como nosotros vivimos una teoría de blanqueamiento, una política de blanqueamiento muy fuerte en el país, casi decir que una proyección social, que se quiere tener movilidad social, va a blanquear tu familia. Vas provavelmente un hombre negro procurar una mujer negra blanca para poder ir blanqueando a su familia. Y en la medida que hay esa movilidad negra y que negros van subiendo, la idea es blanquear o ocultar su propio color. Aparte de las personas de piel muy oscuras, lo que sí pasaba muchísimo en Brasil, ustedes pueden ver hasta hoy con los jugadores de fútbol, que nadie discute que sean negros, pero ellos no se identifican muchas veces como negros. Hay Ronaldo, el fenómeno, por ejemplo, nos encanta cuando él dice, sí, hay mucho racismo en Brasil. Yo no sufro porque no soy negro, entonces no soy víctima de racismo y todo. Y uno mira cómo dice que no es negro. Entonces, era la teoría de los estudios de la UNESCO de Charles Weigand que decía del escape del moreno. O sea, como el moreno podría blanquear su pele para adecuarse en otro contexto social. Por eso discutimos mucho quién son los blancos, finalmente. Pues estos blancos son muchos de estos que se blanquean cuando pasan a otro nivel social. Y hay muchas discusiones sobre esta teoría del escape del moreno, porque dicen, en la última instancia, aunque él cree que está escapando, Ronaldo no va a ser visto como una persona blanca. Y esto también puso muchas discusiones en los censos, en la colecta de datos de los censos. Porque cuando las personas, los colectadores, no sé cómo se dice en español, los recenseadores, como decimos en portugués, van a la casa de la gente y preguntan cuál es su raza, la idea fue hacer varios testes para que fuera auto y hetero declaración. La persona define cuál es su raza y lo que hace la encuesta, el encuestador, también va a marcar lo que él está viendo del color de piel de la persona que está entrevistando. Entonces, los censos trabajan con una doble identificación. ¿Cuál es la raza que él ve y cómo la persona se autoidentifica? Exatamente para intentar matizar este blanqueamiento social que es hecho de la persona. Entonces, todas estas son discusiones que fuimos haciendo en Brasil y con un cierto siempre malestar, porque hubo este cambio en la discusión internacional. Viene un movimiento negro que históricamente está buscando la integración. Y cuando les he hablado de Guerrero Ramos, aún de Abdías menos, pero estos intelectuales negros estaban hablando realmente, no se estaba cuestionando todavía esta cultura, digamos así, occidental de la modernidad. La idea, al contrario, era promover el desarrollo del negro en la sociedad moderna, a través de la educación, de todo eso. Y uno no puede acusarlo, es un periodo, es una época. Y es una época también después que todos estos intelectuales van a involucrarse mucho con las luchas socialistas, con un proyecto anticapitalista nacional, donde la lucha estaba en el antirracismo, pero no en reconocimiento cultural. Todo esto no puede verse nuevo. Con esta dimensión de Brasil hay muchas discusiones. En el momento que, bueno, voy a traer eso después, por ejemplo, en el momento que se discutía Durma las políticas de acciones afirmativas en Brasil, los movimientos sociales se encontraban mucho, el movimiento negro de Bahía y el movimiento negro de São Paulo. Y era muy divertido participar en las reuniones, porque estaban ambos hablando de cultura. Y yo hacía trabajo de campo en la época, estaba terminando mi doctorado, y empezaba cultura negra y tal, entre ellos, y se pelean mucho. Hay mucha pelea entre el Nordeste y la gente de São Paulo, por esta imagen de São Paulo que quiere conducir el país, el estado más desarrollado y tal. Entonces hay muchas discusiones regionales. Y de repente me di cuenta que el movimiento negro de Bahía, cuando está hablando de cultura, está hablando de religiosidad africana, está hablando de las tradiciones ancestrales y tal. Y cuando el movimiento negro de São Paulo estaba hablando en esta época de cultura, estaba hablando de media, televisión, acceso de la imagen del negro, la representación del negro en el mundo de la comunicación. Estava falando de cultura, pero em âmbitos distintos. Os projetos culturais se davam em âmbitos distintos de lo que é a mídia moderna, a comunicação moderna e de lo que é a cultura ancestral, onde estava basando o movimento negro de Bahia. Então, essas são situações que a vezes parece que estão falando de muitas coisas que semelhantes, pero há fundo, uma base que é...
But there's a base that is different, and Sao Paulo is very different from where the Black movement of Rio de Janeiro enters. There is a book that is very interesting that said that the Black movement of Sao Paulo knows more about what happens in the Black movement in the United States than what happens in the Black movement of North and Northeast of Brazil. They're much more linked to what happens in the United States to what is happening in the rest of the country. And there are several explanations because we had a military dictatorship.
Políticos intelectuales negros se
Where
exilaron.
many Black politicians left the country, went to the United States, were in touch with the Black North American movement. In the 1979, the amnesty started in the pardon started in Brazil when politicians started to come back to the country, and many intellectuals came back with a very consolidated dialogue regarding the Afro-American struggle. This is very important in these exchanges that start marking these differences, which is different from what happened in the north of Brazil. And why do I want to discuss all of these complexities? I had said, and I was talking to Guillermo, that when I did my master's degree in Mexico, and since then I have been interested in the different policies of differences and diversity. There was a shift in Latin America, which is the multicultural shift, where the cultural issue of being acknowledged takes the political space. And why? There are some explanations of why at the end of the 80s and at the beginning of the 90s, multiculturalism takes spaces. First, if we take cultural studies from the English, what Stuart Holt says is that this great shift is done because of the decolonization of Africa that puts on the table the role of decolonization, and it will generate the great migration fluxes that for the first time are happening from the south to the north. So for the first time, the north has to face former colonized inhabitants in their territories. The Europeans never talk about the times in which they were immigrants, that they went in mass to the south. It is quite the opposite. They always talk about the people from the south going to the north. We now see the Europeans and North Americans are going to travel and work in multinational companies. They travel, for example, to Singapore, and they don't call themselves immigrants, they are expats because they're leaving their countries in Europe, and since they are researchers, executives, they are expats. Immigrants are the poor. If we take the definition of an immigrant, all of these people are immigrants, but they don't put themselves in that category and create new concepts for themselves, the same way they create specific immigration laws for them. For example, people from Saudi Arabia, although they talk about a dictatorship there, they have no issue when traveling to Europe, buying households, working there. So their studies regarding immigration in Europe is that the issue is who has a right to be an immigrant and who doesn't have a right to be an immigrant. What Stuart says is that Europe had to find a way of manage this immigration that is facing decolonization. There's a very interesting discussion in Europe regarding museums sending back pieces that were robbed from colonized countries. What do you do with the things in the Louvre Museum from the Vatican Museum? I think the Vatican Museum is the most shameful museum in the world. It is made up of rubbed pieces from all cultures in the world. We also have the discussion of reviewing the role of colonizer countries. I think 20 years ago, in the National French Assembly, they passed a law to talk about the benefits of colonization. And they passed a law for this. So from the process of decolonization of Africa, we have the great migration influx. Then we have the crisis of socialism and the end of the Soviet bloc, the disappointment with communism. This will cause a demobilization of movements around socialism, and the cultural matters take the protagonist role. And in this case, Marxism had a great difficulties to deal with racism and gender issues, everything related to women. It is interesting that English cultural studies do this because with the US cultural studies, they changed this a lot, but the English had the idea of adapt and make a critique from and within these racist proposals within Marxism. The discussion was how in the new left they could renovate the left-wing groups to adapt to all of these issues. And in Latin America, we have the indigenous struggle that had a protagonic role because the states were claiming that with integration there will be development for all the peoples. And these are years that involve great indigenous revolts that will end in the year 94 with the Zapatista uprising. And here we will see the entering of Mexico in the NAFTA and neoliberalism. And then we have Canada, of course, because they were going through separatism in Quebec. And their multiculturalism as a philosophical thought comes from the Canadian, from the discussion of how to adapt the cultural differences within the same state. There's an interesting aspect in Canada because this discussion is done related to Quebec, but not to the Canadian Indigenous peoples. This didn't emerge because of the Indigenous struggle. It was because of the Francophone Quebec and the English-speaking Canada. But then the indigenous people start having a protagonic role in multiculturalism and this discussion that was taking place. Then we have several theories that start emerging. There's a lot of discussion on cultures. At the beginning, it was more related to cultures, and Latin America, it was related to the indigenous struggle. But then afterward, the Black struggle will be also involved in this discussion of differences. And why I was interested in all of this, I arrived in the year 94 during the Zapatista uprising. I was an anthropologist We usually do not deal with geopolitics. Anthropologists do more local studies. But during this year, you weren't able to talk about the indigenous if you didn't talk about NAFTA. And you couldn't talk about indigenous people without talking about the Zapatista uprising. But this cannot only be an indigenous movement, because the Zapatista movement wanted to talk about the economic, fiscal, territorial reform, the distribution of the land. This wasn't a movement made only to talk about the indigenous people rights, because when the process of negotiation with the Mexican government started, Zapatistas proposed different dialogue groups. And what did they stated? They had reform, territory, economic reform, different discussion tables. And the only one the government was ready to accept was the one involved with protecting the culture. And it is interesting because you wanted to protect the indigenous culture, but they didn't allow them to be part of the national project. And the thing is, the indigenous struggle cannot be only on the interest of the indigenous people. You cannot have a national project without having discussions from the state with the indigenous groups, because then you're going to create policies that aren't part of the national policies, and you are not going to be part of the discussion of what project you want for the country. People were saying a different country is possible, and from there they decided they had to reshape the national project of the Mexican state and to include the proposals of the indigenous peoples, because they had a lot to talk about, not only about the issues they had there, but also about the nation that they were building. And I think that's very interesting in how the Zapatistas are going to face this movement with what was coming in from Canada with the NAFTA. So when I left Mexico, I lived in France, and there were migration influx from Algeria, from the Maghrebis, and I wanted to study multiculturalism in Europe and how they lived this process. And I was with a specialist of multiculturalism in France. And then I moved to Algeria. And it was great because when we discuss cultural differences, there are different internal differences. So we talk about indigenous peoples here in Latin America. How can you imagine that peoples that come from Alaska, from Canada, and that went down to the Patagonia, how are they all the same? How do they have different realities if they come from Alaska and went from Patagonia? And when I went to Mexico, they didn't call themselves indigenous because they said the indigenous were a term from colonizers. They were just another people. And with multicultural policies, The indigenous people became a political important element in the world of politics, and this category is retaken within this context. But one thing is the category and then the instrumentalization of this category in the world of politics. But the fact that people recognize themselves as belonging to a group does not determine them according to a category because categories are transformed, they change their meaning according to the historical and political context. And I think this is important to understand the debate we're going to have on Brazil, how these changes and what are the different policies that are being activated, that are being implemented, and the indigenous matter explains this. So with the Zapatista movement that's going through all the states of Mexico to be in touch with the different ethnicities to talk about the national project. I forgot the name in Spanish. I don't remember the name, but this political building process was very interesting because many of the indigenous leaders were involved in the struggles of the left. So how were they going to mix the struggle of the left with the indigenous struggles? When I arrived to Algeria, I realized that what I was reading from Algerian and African intellectuals that were writing regarding their relation with France, that were talking about the discrimination of the French, and we're talking about a common Islam that was giving them a single identity, and the fight was against the oppression from France. But once you arrived and you are in Algeria and you start reading local writers, you realize that there are other differences, that there's another context. What anthropologists wrote in Algeria was not related to France, but to the internal context and history of the country. So I discovered that Islam has multiple divisions, multiple interpretations, that there was a population that was suffering from a great level of discrimination from the Arabs that arrived to Algeria because they were there before France, that they were invaded from Romans. They have giant Roman cities. They also have a Jew occupation, and it was a very complex country that was had a Islam that was more sunny, and there was terrorism fed from the different Islamic trends that were coming from Egypt, and that changed the traditional dynamics of Islam that they had, that they knew. And also Algerian migrants that were living in France, when they went to Algeria, they were taking their Islam. They didn't use hijab. That didn't exist in in Algeria. Women did use some kind of hijab, but it was very different. And now this is started to be imposed in Algeria, and this was imported from migrants to Algeria.
This was something that called my attention. I began to work with an association of women in Algeria. I don't work a lot with that, but that was the main matter in the country. When I worked with them, I had a friend, And Algerian women worked a lot for the independence of Algeria. They were very important for their independence. And they were able to gain a very strong political space after the revolution. The problem was that in the 80s, in the era of terrorism, of those who were supported by the Muslims and shared by people who had won the election, and he began with the terrorism. And the way in which the government was able to determine what terrorism was, it was a terrorism where the world closed the borders for Algeria. Morocco closed the border to Algeria. Algeria was isolated from the world. They suffered the worst terrorisms in the world. The way or the concession that the government gave to the terrorists was the Code of Family in 1984. And what does the Family Code does? Women could not inherit anything. Women were subordinated. Women sold all their rights. The state sold women as a concession for the end to terrorism. So Algeria has a problem that is very recent, since 1984. So the fight of this organization was a criticism to the imposition of the hijab, an imposition of this Islam, which was not common in the country, etc. The representative of this organization did not use the hijab because she said that's not something that belongs to us. When she took a flight and when she went to France, in the plane, she wore the hijab. She put it on. She did not understand. And I didn't understand. I mean, she wears the hijab, and this has nothing to do with her culture. And what she answered to me was, the French people do not have the right to tell me what I should use or not. When I am in France, I wear the hijab. It was a political resistance, and Algeria was one of the most opposition to the hijab. I'm very careful in order not to generalize the elements, because it's very necessary to place the elements within their political contexts, because the diversity is multiplied. While I worked in the peripheries that the Maghrebs are in France, they were all together, the Algerians, the people from Morocco, the Africans people. When I came down to Algeria, there wasn't a discussion. The country was all Muslim. The Muslim difference between Muslims and Christians was not evident. So they were all Muslims. The differences that were activated were differences that were internal. This is why we had the conception of identity, which is very important, because the identity is what is created in the spaces of borders, is a contrast with the other person, what is going to define me. It is based on cultural elements, but the identities are fed from this opposition, from this encounter with the other human being. It doesn't exist by itself. It is built. It's something that is that flows, that is historical. It is a reconstruction, the identities. We cannot generalize the cultures and identities because they are built historically and they change, they transform themselves. And this was a very enriching experience for me, to come out of France, to go to Algeria, and then to have the opportunity to live in the country. I remember a discourse that a speech that I gave once with someone who was always writing about Europe, about the diaspora, and then he went to live in Africa. And for him, it was a return to his home. And Provina said, I didn't recognize myself. I didn't know the local context of the country. I didn't know the internal struggles that existed within the country. Then I went to Mexico, France, Algeria, and I went to the United States working with for the North American movement. But between the indigenous people and the Black population, what always seems interesting to me is what this political movement and historical movement is all about. It has been called multiculturalism, and it takes the space of international organisms, politicians of the state, and how this movement dialogues with the neoliberalism or with the socialist proposals that unfortunately the ones who have been more present in this discussion of multiculturalisms are the neoliberalists who have assumed this discussion. And there are authors today who say that we are not talking anymore about multiculturalism. We have already lived an era of multiculturalism. So what is happening in the world, with the exception of the extreme right, we are walking towards another perspective. And I like a lot the idea of a French theorist, and I don't want to say his name because these intellectuals sometimes say things and sometimes you don't agree with what they say, and that's why I don't like to tell their names. But he said something that seems quite interesting to me. He said that the GEF movement, that the anti-racist movement has a problem, that the racist movement is always responding to the racist movement. When the racist movement is supported on the differences like the fascist theories, the anti-racist movement is resorting to equality. We are all equal, there are no differences, etc. When the racist movement supports equality to invisibilize the racism, then we defend the difference, the recognition of the difference of cultures. The problem, what he says, and the new extreme right is betting for this difference. What he says is that we are leaving that circle. We are always given the response. We are not asking, we're always responding to the movement of the oppressor, and we need to find a way to answer, to give an answer to this movement. And maybe all that debate of the new etymologies help us to answer, to give response to this movement, and to stop answering only to this cycle between differences and equality all the time. There's always the risk of the essentialism, of the categorizations, of the stereotypes, of all these things that we are building. Why? I like a lot what Charles Hay called about the permitted indigenous people, because they create patterns of what being indigenous is, of what being Black is, and the groups and the ethnicities that do not correspond to these patterns are isolated. And what he says about this permitted indigenous people is the indigenous person that cannot be a guerrilla, that cannot be rebellious, that cannot answer to the state, is an indigenous person who can only talk about his culture, his ancestors, but he cannot respond to the state. These are the indigenous people that the international organisms want. They want to be protected, but they cannot do what the Zapatists did. They want to reform this state. What Chalgueiro called the permitted indigenous, we can mention here all the differences. Amongst the differences, there are other projects, there are other political intentions, there are other political proposals. We can imagine, if we know Africa, that Africa is being treated as one sole country. This is something that is incredible to me. People in Brazil talk about Africa, but they forget that Africa is a continent with different cultures, with different inheritances, with different histories, with very different colonizations. The British colonization, the French colonization, they were very different from the Spanish one, etc. So I made this introduction, which seems important to me, for you to understand when I talk about Brazil, how complex it is, how difficult it is in a continental country with such big differences from a regional standpoint to reach a common project of the Black struggle. There are many intentions of the Black movement in Brazil, but during the 70s, we have been able, or through Dias Nascimento, to build the Black movement that is unified, the unified Black movement in Brazil. There was anti-discriminatory fight and anti-racism, because this joins the Black experience in Brazil. And when I talk about discrimination, I talk about discrimination of the Black people, injustice in social services, in religion, in all the different areas of social life for this population. Do you have any doubt? Do you have any question? Can I continue after giving this introduction? Okay, we are going to have a break. Maybe 15 minutes or 10 minutes? Let us take a break, but please let us try to have just a 10-15-minute break at the most. Thank you.
Fueron a un break.
Bueno, vamos a ir tomando asiento, quienes no lo han hecho todavía para...
Please, let's be seated so that we can continue.
Seguimos entonces con
Let's
Rebeca.
continue with Rebecca.
Adelante.
Hay una manzana.
Oh, there's an apple.
Hay, hay una manzana rodando por
There
aquí
is
por el
an
medio del
apple
pasillo,
right
no sé
here
quién
in the
es.
middle of the hallway. I don't know who's the owner of the apple.
Hay una manzana que... La manzana de Einstein. Ah, sí, hay una manzana. Manzana de Einstein. A ver, retomamos las láminas.
Okay, let's resume with the slides.
Pero bueno, retomamos
Well,
entonces.
let's resume.
Voy adelantando mientras yo
I'm going to start talking while the PowerPoint
podemos
is
seguir con
ready.
la próxima.
Can we continue with the next slide, please?
Esta.
And the other one?
Esta muy
That
rápido.
one.
En esta
Mm.
discusión del
Very quickly, in that discussion of the
multiculturalismo,
multiculturalism, there are several trends that aroused theoretical, political. The one that was well known was the liberal multiculturalism of Liga, who was the one who adopted the international organisms that are a theoretical framework of Liga, based in Canada. This is known as the liberal theory of the rights of minorities. How can we recognize the collective rights always with respect to their insertion within the conception of the universal rights, of the human rights? How can we provide protection of the ethnical cultural minorities within the framework of the individual rights? This is why it is known as a liberal culturalism, and it is one way of managing diversity. There are, since 2000, 2004, I'm always confused with this because, well, with the World Bank issued a report based on Quimilica. It was a report of the World Bank regarding the management of the diversity of the differences and of the states. How can they adapt the states to attend and protect their differences? There are other perspectives like the ones from Charles Taylor and the group of the theories of recognition that will try to recognize the collective identities as a necessary part, an intrinsic part of the human dignity. People, to be able to make progress, have to have their identities recognized, their cultural identities. So this was the proposals for the recognition of Charles Taylor, of Charles Horner, and of Nancy Fraser, and the discussion of the theories of redistribution, which she proposes. She proposes a dialogue with the recognition, how to work with the cultural recognition, and at the same time, keeping the importance of the redistribution. And why does Nancy Fraser bring that discussion? In order not to work only with the discussion at the level of the culture, of the cultural recognition. What is in dispute is the protagonism, to try the social classes, social differences, social inequalities, or to try to, or to treat the cultural recognition. So the debate that she does is communities, communitarian. This is very difficult to translate because it's issued by the Canadians, but they had a very strong importance with the organization of the international organisms and the recommendation of the international policies of the United Nations regarding the collective rights. And they had importance for the interpretation of the international conventions that we all know. The UN 69 of the indigenous people, and then the whole discussion about the conventions related to the African descent people. And at the same time, there was a proposal that is known with the idea of the communitarist that supported the community point of view, denying the subjectivity of the individuals because they're going to think about the individual inserted in a community, subjugated to the collectivity, to the culture. The culture is significant to determine what the individual is. So these are positions that are going to be in dispute. And now I'm going to talk about the next slide. What Kimilika proposes is that the international organisms, the citizenship and the cultural citizenship, that's what they call them. And they have three proposals: the rights of self-governments, the autonomies, the self-determination for the state to think about some type of cultural federalism. And when we talk about groups that are territorialized, like indigenous groups, that given their political authorities and juridical authorities can be recognized as people who belong to one autonomous region. Or polyethnical rights, which is the recognition of cultural expressions, mainly in processes of integration. Here they address minority groups, groups that defend their own culture, their own tradition, and want to demand. They can be migrants, they can be indigenous groups that are located at the border of the cities. They all become subjects of collective rights, but they don't have the right to self-determination. They do not constitute a nation itself. Or special representation rights, which means to create spaces for representation for representatives of determined or specific populations. Let's remember what Colombia did in the Constitution of 1991, which reserved spaces in the parliament for representatives of indigenous people and people of African descent. So this was a proposal that meant a summatory of rights that could be present and could be adapted to the national constitutions. However, there is one important issue arising from this proposal, and that is that all these rights must be subordinated to the human rights. This is the limit that is given for all these recognitions of rights. Next slide. To this liberal culturalism, which is well known and that includes the theory of Sorel about equality and the theories about equality, there are other proposals that aroused in the scenario and that got together in different theoretical frameworks. The radical pluralization of the citizenship, which is to break with the Republican commitment of the unitary citizenship, and that the principles of the specific rights of the group must be limited by the principles of individual liberty, social equality, and political democracy. This is one strong criticism to this idea that above all, we must have this delimitation. The idea is for us to think about the citizenship in a different way. There were different plans in that sense. If we remember Pablo González Casanova in Mexico, They had programs on cultural and ethnical, and Pablo said that it was necessary to understand the citizenship in a wide manner, the definition of who the citizen is and what the political participation is based on an ethnical issue. There's a very good text of Pablo González Casanova when he talks about the project of the Soviet Union. And Pablo said that at the beginning, there was a whole structure for recognizing and organizing the various ethnicities in the Soviet bloc. There were different cultural groups. And this is very important because when we talk about the indigenous autonomies, the first process that took place in the coast of Nicaragua, where we had the Mezquitos, indigenous people, they have Afro descendants people, and it was a regional project. The idea was to create an autonomic zone with the support of the federal government and the state, but with juridical and political autonomy. This model of autonomy were the models that were thought based on the proposal that was made from the Soviet Union that Lenin discussed, that Stalin had wrote a short book about the autonomies. And what Pablo González Casanova explained is that as the Soviet project progressed, it focused on the social discussion, and all this project reaccommodated
diferentes, não grupos, de diferentes
of
culturas.
the different groups and cultures that existed, and this started to be lost, which is one of the justifications of the end of the Soviet world, the ethnic conflicts that emerged within the Soviet globe. So when Pablo González talks about autonomies and brings this project, that's not the liberal project. Even when Zapatismo was launched in Mexico and talks about autonomy and self-governance, which was something that wasn't conceived in the first Zapatista plan, but then a few intellectuals that were part of the plan of Nicaragua, they brought the proposal to the regional multi-ethnic autonomies, a new way of government that was being thought, how to adjust and think about other ways of governing that wasn't only the federal government, states, and municipalities. And it had also cultural autonomy. That's what allowed them to gain spaces that was defined by an indigenous community that earned the right to have a self-government. And it will advance in this discussion because when the Bolivia project arrived, they wanted to create a plurinational state. So Bolivia completely changes these proposals. So this also part of the constitutional reforms throughout Latin America. If the 88, the reform from the 88 in Brazil was very important, then we have the constitutional reform in Mexico, then we have Zapatismo, and then we have all the other constitutions that are being reformed in Latin America regarding multiculturalism in countries, until we reach the most developed one in Bolivia. And today, the Constitution of the City of Mexico this used to be a federal district, it is now a state, and it is considered one of the most advanced constitutions regarding the recognition of collective rights. So since the 90s, at the end of the 80s, everything we witnessed was a movement for adapting to these demands of cultural recognitions. And in this scenario, we also have post-colonial, decolonial, and post-modern studies, which are perspectives that will reflect on culture and recognition from a critique to modernity, to Western thinking and capitalism. So all of these theoretical discussions emerge. For example, there's this book in which they talk about emancipatory multiculturalism, which is a proposal of cultural recognition and its political potential for organizing the population in resistance struggles. We also have the subaltern studies that started to be created in Latin America that are part of the decolonial discussion that weren't decolonial yet. And then we have cultural studies from the United States. We also have proposals of Latin American cultural studies. Although they have a characteristic that is generated simultaneously. So the Latin Americans in the United States, we have the figure Eduardo Restrepo in Colombia, which was one of the scholars that came from Stuart. Then we have marginalization studies. Quijano works with that in the 60s. With the theories of marginality, social marginality during the times of Quijano, and it didn't cover ethnic aspects, but the construction of social marginalization, and it stated that capitalism needs these people that are marginalized in order to exist. So it proposes that although people say they didn't enter the system, it actually means that capitalism needs these people. So it is interesting to see how these groups start to be formed in order to found the decolonial movement in the United States in dialogue with Latin America, and how they are developed in Latin America. And we can discuss that in more detail. When we talk in the book, Carlos and me, we don't talk about a proposal regarding multiculturalism, but a theoretical and political movement in which there was a multicultural shift in Latin America, and their discussion goes from social differences and focuses on recognizing collective identities and specific rights. And there were critics and it goes with the principle of cultural neutrality. And it is important for the state to be a part of the recognition of culture, But there are critics of multiculturalism that state that these religious and cultural differences must be part of private life, but in public spaces there should only be the universal common elements. And this is the critique that comes from liberals. They talk about the public space as the universal citizenship space. Another critique that is done is trying to make multicultural policies out of context in a universal way. So when there was this liberal multiculturalism debate, um, it involved international bodies. People ask what to do with Black people, African descendants. They're not originary autochthon people to talk about self-governance. They're just the diaspora, and they are part of urban areas in great cities. So if they are culturally diverse, how do we make it part of this political structure? So we're going to have affirmative actions for this population because they aren't a collective policy, but a policy of individual integration. So I am going to integrate these individuals in the chain of work. So it is for integration and not cultural integration. So they emerge in the context of multiculturalism, and they emerge to deal with diaspora and then to talk about gender. And why there's a critique to making policies universal. I go back to Stuart Helen. In this organization I was working, it was an Algerian organization, and there were women working there in Algeria. So while the Algerian organization was talking about ending the family code, a recent one from the year 1984, but UN women were talking about creating affirmative actions for women so they could be inserted into specific spaces. Honestly, in this country, I thought it was ridiculous. Those women were already part of the political public spaces. They were struggling for their independence. And because of a concession of the government, they created a absurd family code that took away their rights. Having representation of women in specific spaces was not their struggle. The struggle was to end the family code. Back then, even intellectuals stopped supporting this code. So it was bizarre because they had this formula we're going to apply everywhere, and they said, okay, in Algeria we're going to have affirmative actions for women. And why did they do that? There was a contradiction between United Nations women and the local organization. And the issue was that when they made an international report, they become the international policy to be applied in every single country, even if countries have different realities. And politicians and people, these authorities from international organizations don't have dialogues with local governments. So they arrive and they already know what they're going to do to develop the region, but it is very disconnected with the reality of the local region. And then we have ghettos within culture. Taylor talks about multiculturalism, and he says that when they started to talk about teaching Afro-American history, there was a very smart proposal. We're going to promote this only for Black children. And Taylor said, no, white children also need to have these classes. They need to know Afro-American history. They need to, which because it's part of the history of this country. And Taylor explained that this was corrupting the principle of multiculturalism because back then they didn't discuss interculturality. This was only within the collective rights plan. And then we have discrimination, which has always been very important for Black issues. Protocols of discrimination, laws for against discrimination. So we just recognize their culture, their self-government, but in their own spaces. And they also talked about cultural reorganization. For example, Muslims said that women could not enter pools without men, so they had to have other pools so women could enter by themselves. But back then, people were not talking about interculturality. Multiculturalism was criticized because people said, okay, we have the indigenous people, Afro-descendants, laws, religion recognition. This is marvelous. But what about effectiveness? It is not effective. And what they started to call neoliberal multiculturalism, they say, okay, they recognize culture, but the projects for developing indigenous land, all of these issues continued. And it is neoliberal because what multiculturalism does is working with focused policies. For example, with when Mexico joined NAFTA, they had household healthcare projects and public services changed its structure with privatization. And back then, in the indigenous people that want to have households, they must associate themselves, which meant having a civil association that was formal, legal, so they could be recognized and then participate in the household projects of the government. However, a civil association is not the representation of a people, it is just a civil association. So they started to create different civil associations, like different indigenous NGOs, and this caused a fragmentation because it caused conflicts between the associations. So they created, it was a movement of indigenous NGOs, and Zapatismo stated that we are not a social movement, we're not going to have a legal figure, because that means we're going to be controlled by the state. But in order to have access to those projects, they needed to have an association. And all of these projects started to be determined by groups. Then the other transformation was related to social policies for revenue distribution. When we talk about structural distribution of the income. So, for example, in Brazil, we have education scholarships and they start offering small policies. But the issue is that they have a small reach. It doesn't have an ample reach. This has also happened in Mexico, for example. So this was the discussion. Bolsonaro said it would be better to offer scholarships so people can go to private schools instead of public schools.
Lula had proposed a program that was called Zero Hunger. This is a structural program. It's a program that exists in India for the redistribution of the government for the population. The international organisms and the entire discussion aroused with the family, which is a transference of the resources for the family, which forces the families to open accounts in the banks, and this generates money for the banks. The family scholarship was very important for Brazil and took lots of people out of poverty. But the same president said, this is not a structural program. This is not a strengthening of the public services. We are feeding with money the banks. But the program Hunger Zero was not successful in India. This is what the focalized policies are for. They start to focus themselves on specific groups. And these authors, that is called neoliberal multiculturalism. And there is an Black intellectual that is called Mario Teodoro, who says that basic services are universal services. The poverty is resolved with universal policies, and the focal policies have to be arranged when there are populations that cannot have access to this service. In this case, the state has to work directly, or a population that due to discrimination is not able to have access to the universal policies, then you have to make a specific policy for them. But the assets of the state, like education and health, cannot be granted in a focalized manner. And the multiculturalism feeds these proposals of the multiculturalism. We stop talking about the reform of the social state. It is the crisis of the social well-being, the end of the socialist proposals, and we start talking. First, we identify culturally, and then we start making policies. This has transformed many groups. There have been many important transformations within the groups. I worked for years in Mexico, and if we take a look at that study, there are 15 indigenous organizations in the city. A city with almost 1 million inhabitants were benefited. But this is very small vis-a-vis the gigantic universe of the population. But this short number is going to enter in the reports of the international organisms as if those were the good practices. And I am sorry, but I am scared of those that term of good practices. What are good practices that the international organisms use? The best award for the best officer of the month is the officer that had the best practices for the world. So who decides this is a good practice or not? This is what they try, and there's a critic of some authors that is called the neoliberal multiculturalism, the creation of this multiculturalism and its appropriation of all these focalized policies. That chart that you might not be able to see, but I might be able to share this presentation. This is the last report of the World Bank that was issued regarding the people of African descent. Nowadays, nobody can talk about multiculturalism because there's a strong criticism. However, the World Bank made a chart of the type of policies that must be applied for the people of African descent, and this report is for Latin America. They don't talk about multiculturalism, they talk about ethnopolitics, racial equality policies, and territorial policies. It was more or less the same division that we had before within the multiculturalism. And when they talk about the African descents, they said, one, when they are political ethnicities, with reference to the agreement of 69 about indigenous people, dominant discourse, ethnicity, right to differences. Objective population, rural communities that are Afro-descendants and Afro-indigenous minorities. Types of reforms promoted, protection and promotion of collective rights. Examples of promoted policies, territorial rights, political autonomies, development driven by communities, education, consultation and decision-making, recognition, cultural recognition, recovery and protection of historic memory, protection of development, protection of traditional ways of life, political quotas and representation. Racial equality policies, I'm not going to talk about this, but this is for the Brazilian example. It is more focused on the discrimination, and I'm going to talk about that further on. And policies of territorial development, intersectorial policies, development of abandoned regions, Afro-descendants who live in abandoned regions, multisectorial development, development of infrastructure, inclusion in the national system of education and health, connection with markets, housing, policies directed for the best integration of independent regions regardless of the race. So what the World Bank does is that it doesn't talk anymore about multiculturalism. What it does is that it makes a division of the different types of policies. Racial equalities today is in vogue for them. And it is very interesting when you follow the reports. Before the international report talked about development, everything was development. During the 60s and the 70s, the word in vogue was development. In the 70s, they started talking about sustainable development. Then they started talking about cultural differences in the years 2000, then inequality. Nobody talks about development nowadays. They only talk about inequalities. The people of the right wing always talk about inequality. The last report talks about the capacity that they have to appropriate these concepts that we developed in the academia to build policies based on these concepts. So to me, I believe it is very interesting. And there's another aspect. They hire consultants, academic consultants for the reports. Even myself, I did a report for the Organization of Ibero-American States. And what I love about this is that they hire you and they tell you, the responsibility of the report is yours. And when the reports are published, they say that the World Bank is not accountable for that report. But if you say, I want to write about this, they tell you, no, you can't, because that is part of the bank. You do not have the right to use it for your report. And at the same time, if it is criticized, it's not the bank's fault. It is me who is criticized. So there's a debate in the academia. What should we do? What should academics do when we participate in these consultancies? This is very important. How can we act along with these consultancies? We have to be very aware of politics, of policies. I cannot say that I won't make a report again. Maybe it's better for us to make the reports instead of others because we can be more strategic on the way we make the reports. But it is very interesting to see in the long run how they change their political discourse. And the speed with which they assume the new academic assumptions. They're very quick. They're very attentive to the new debates. And regarding inequality is terrible. To see them talking about inequalities and to see that they are people from the right, they're capitalists that have a large idea that for the economic development with the juridical security, foreign investors to avoid conflict, for that is necessary to promote a higher well-being, to prepare the workers. In short, there's a whole framework that is built around the conception of inequality. And it's to talk about inequality and not to talk about capitalism itself. What should we do with the capitalism? The next slide, please. And finally, if you don't have any doubts, I can start talking about people of African descent and talk about Brazil. Regarding the people of African descent, we have the preparation of the World Conference Against Racism and Discrimination, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and the connected, which was a very important framework that you know very well, and the Strategic Alliance for Latin America and the Caribbean with participation of the most important organizations of the region. I told you that to that work that Carlos Agudelo did with mapping of all the international organizations. And there we have what the World Bank did, ECLAC, OAS, the Spanish Agency of Cooperation, the Ibero-American General Secretariat. All these works started to be done in this context, within the perspective, in the perspective of the Black NGOs. And Brazil is a protagonist. But as I said before, multiculturalism was addressed to the indigenous populations. And there was an international movement that was very important in order to enter this scenario. There were several meetings where they claimed that these rights should include the Afro-descendants. But today is the other way around. The indigenous people have lost spaces, and it is the African descents who have gained more spaces in this international debate in Latin America. Regarding the Black NGOs, I will talk about that later on. Next slide. I'm going to talk about this very quickly, but I couldn't evade this because this is something that I study. I am sometimes quite critical from a political standpoint. So in this same period, several projects, academic projects arose directed to the studies of the African descents in Latin America, different studies from the United States and from Europe. And why am I interested in these academic projects and how they are financed? One of the first projects where I was part of was the Afrodesk, which is an international project of African descent and slavery, domination, identification, and patrimony in the Americas. It was a French project with resources, with French resources, and it was one of the first projects that included a panorama of the people of African descent in Latin America. What happens with these projects is that these are projects that are designed in Europe and that are applied in Latin America. And I know the people who made this project. These people are very good. They involve academics from Latin America, and they involve leaderships from the indigenous people or Black people. But you know that there's a lot of hierarchy in the academia. We continue discussing. We always say that there is a space of a lot of discrimination, and the academic missionaries the academics who think that they're going to save the world, and people who talk for the people. So these are projects. The Afrodesk, especially with the intellectuals of Mexico. Mexico was rediscovering their Afro-descendant people, and this has to do with their history, etc. So they had to reconstruct the history of the Afro-descendants in Latin America. Then there was a project of Henry Louis Gates, which I recommend to you. This is a project that was compared with Brazil, Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Colombia. This is a project of a professor of Harvard, a Black professor that is well known in the United States, who has always worked with African American, and he discovered Latin America. He made a documentary in each one of the countries I mentioned, and there is something that is very interesting. It's very stereotyped. He brought good people, but is highly stereotyped. But the Black intellectuality in North America started to get interested in the Latin America African descents. Why? In this moment in the United States, there was in the United States a Brazilianization of the United States. It was a Latin Americanization of the United States. There are two problems. A first problem, Latin American people, African descent, and there was always a problem of how to classify them, especially people from Brazil, because Brazilians, the Brazilians in the United States are not classified as Hispanics. They are not classified. They were classified as African American. If they were whites, they were classified as whites. But imagine that Brazilians are not white. So there was a lot of debate in this matter and how to classify in the North American census all this diversity. But also there was another problem. There was a displacement in the United States of a racial criticism to a criticism to the poverty of African American. Many Black intellectuals started to denounce that the United States had to discuss about social class and Black poverty apart from the racism and discrimination. And this is when they start talking about the Brazilianization of the United States. These are intellectuals of the right wing, progressist intellectuals with different positions, but they began to analyze this. Moreover, the affirmative actions with the economic crisis of 2008 mainly, the third generation of the affirmative actions in the United States, there was a financial crisis, there was more money for the universities, for scholarships. There was a crisis in the United States that was very strong. There was a transformation in the discourse of the Black intellectuality until the last movement, which is Black Lives Matter, which is a movement that brings together the poor whites because it's a movement that accepts the criticism to capitalism. And this is quite original in the United States. On the contrary, opposed to the United States in Brazil, the discussion was the bipolarization, whites and Blacks. So the criticism that some intellectuals make in Brazil is that, are we copying the United States? Are we creating a bipolar society of whites against Blacks? Since Brazil tends to do what the United States, and the United States tends to follow what Latin America is and what Brazil is, where the racial crisis cannot be detached from the social crisis. So Gate did that project. There's another project that is called Perla. It's a project about the ethnicity of race in Latin America, Mexico, Colombia, Cuba, Brazil. I don't think Venezuela was part of that project. There are other countries that were part of that project, like Peru. This Perla project was quite contradicting because what does Perla do? They had like a palette of colors from the whitest person to the darkest person. And in order to identify people and differentiate the indigenous from the blacks, they marked the palette of color for the color of the person who was being interviewed. And of course, this was terrible because this palette of colors existed in the era of the racist theories. And the discourse is a project of Eduardo Teles, who was the director of the Foundation of Brazil when there was the discussion of the affirmative actions. And the discourse was that they wanted to show that poverty has color. And since there are many differences in Latin America in the way to identify people, nothing better to be more objective than having a palette of colors. But we are not doing anything similar to with the racist theories because we are not creating degrees of evolution. We are simply marking the people. But you can imagine a country like Brazil that suffered so much with the racist theories to have an instrument that biologically marks with the palette of colors.
This created caused many critics, especially in Mexico, because they mainly included indigenous people and didn't describe ethnicities. They were categorizing populations and indigenous people, but just by identifying their skin color and not culture. So Perla Project was contradictory, and I agree with what some critics say because Edward Telles tried to apply the classification of skin color that exists in Brazil to the rest of Latin America, when identification in other parts of Latin America do not follow the same classification. So this US project that involved Latin American intellectuals had was very contradictory because, for example, the cover of the book had the different colors of the classification. In Brazil, when the book was published in a very shy manner because they were fearing critics. However, some projects from organizations in Brazil were using this color palette that came from the Perla project. It was used as a research tool. Methodological instruments cannot be used so easily because you can have a strong impact. You'll see that in Brazil, that biological identification are dramatic. There are other projects, for example, the one from the Austin University, which is very interesting. It involved different Latin American researchers. They proposed a horizontal relation with Latin Americas, but with many internal disputes. And what's the issue? They have the funds. They are the ones who are going to determine what is going to be done. And we don't have the funds, the financial funds, to promote continental projects. They have the resources, but we don't. This is a project I dream off, and we created a structure in Brazil so we could send students to make research in other countries, even in Europe and the United States, not to study those regions as we do, but to have, for example, studies in of Afro-Americans in the outskirts of the United States, the outskirts of Europe. So we stop copying the theories without knowing how they're applied in their own countries. So I think it is fundamental to have the ability to organize international projects, but we don't have the resources. Even in Brazil, we spend a lot of money is spent, and in the case of research agencies, the funds are used to send our youth to study in the US and Europe, and they send them to study in the Institute of Latin America. So they're sent there to listen to the Europeans to talk about Latin America. But now the idea is to create our own project, work, for example, in France and work with the communities in the outskirts. So the protection and domination of the academia do not allow this. German scholarships and European scholarships force you to study in these Latin American institutes. So there's a deep debate in these spaces. That's why I love to talk about academic projects, because they're going to build Black culture from their theoretical budget. And I have to say they have a massive force. We have another project regarding Latin America, of which I am part of it, but I am critic of it. And we're trying to be horizontal and occupy these spaces. Unfortunately, sometimes we cannot propose these spaces themselves. And now we have this famous project in Latin America. I don't know if you know it. It is a Harvard project on Afro-Latin Americans from the University of Harvard. And it has invited to take Afro-descendants from Latin America, Afro-descendants from Latin America to study in Harvard in big amounts, great numbers. They are applied individuals. I cannot talk about people individually, but honestly, I wouldn't like my students to go to Harvard to come back to talking about Afro-descendants in Brazil, and people go with this illusion of what Harvard is such a great university. I was once a professor in Harvard when I lived in the United States. And I think, but this is colonization, even if you have a good intention, if these scholars, these Latin American professors within Harvard, but there's a construction of Afro-Latin Americans, and even if there's a dialogue, the funds, the money from foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation. So after seeing this, what is the meaning of these international projects? Especially because they say they are creating the study framework for Afro-Latin American studies. But what were they doing previously? Intellectuals in Latin America that had been studying for centuries, they also were part of the Afro-Latin American studies, field studies. And I always say that even if we're part of these structures, we also must be very careful, because the fact that all the financial resources come from that structure, that will have an influence on the project, because scholars have to send reports to universities on events, discussions, and they have to be evaluated by the university. And then we have the projects from Claxo, which does not involve the United States. And it is believed that it includes Latin Americans in the region. Then we have the census in Brazil. And here we go to the main point, racial classification in Brazil. I shared the census so you understand what I'm talking about. I don't know if you can read the slide, but the first census was done in 1872. So we already have a tradition of classification in the census. There were still people enslaved in Brazil. So there was this classification, free men, slaves. So for free men, there was white, preto, and pardo. And the indigenous people disappeared because they were assimilated into the other ethnicities. And for slaves, it was preto or pardo, black and brown. Then in 1890, they maintained the same classification. Instead, the only difference is that they use mestizo for pardos and caboclas for the indigenous peoples. In 1940, they keep the same idea, but they just include yellow for people of Asian origin, especially the Japanese. Then in 1950, 60, 80, and 91, they maintained the same categories, but in 1991, they include the indigenous people. Up to that point, the indigenous people were not included in the census. Then in the year 2000 and 2010, what happened in the 1991, that it was after the Brazilian Constitution. How are we going to identify this population? Again, self-declaration, hetero-declaration, we maintain the same classification. When the Black Unified Movement emerged in 1988, there was the category Black, Pardo, and Preto were together in the category Black. It is a little bit weird, but the idea was that Black is my race and Pardo or Preto is my skin color. So Black was the political category of resistance, and Preto and Pardo are my skin colors. So the idea that we reached that 50% of the population was a vindication of the Black movement. So the state will welcome this classification, including Pardo and Preto. Preto, the ones with darker skin colors, but also all the other physical characteristics, the hair, the nose, and Pardo people that had a lighter skin color, both that were brown. There was also classification when our Statistics Institute and the Statistics and Demography Institute, they first made a sample to test the categories they were going to use for the census. And we also have household research that they do in between census regarding different aspects, for example, social condition. Before the census, they did a research to know how people identified themselves, to see if there was a change after the Constitution, to see how people identified themselves. And they made open questions. Let's test how people identify themselves. There were around 165,000 answers regarding skin color, and the conclusion was, okay, Pardo can include all of these colors. They also tried with brown. The issue is that in Brazil, you can say you can have a white person, the skin color, and have dark hair, and they are called dark skin or brunette. So the thing is, this category could also include white people with dark hair. And if you go to Brazil, you will see that many people are not blondies. So you would include a lot of the white population. So they eliminated that. Then they tried to use the origin. Maybe if they ask about the origin, they could have a demographic category. The thing is that over 90% said that their origin was Brazilian. Not many people said Italian, African, and here you can see how strong was the building of national identity from Getulio Vargas. We suffered discrimination, but there was this national identity effort that transformed how people saw themselves with and the Brazilian anthropophagy. They realized that origin, as they used in the United States, didn't work for Brazil. They tried to use biology with genetic scientists, but they said, no, we cannot identify the race, the skin color using biology. And there was a debate on this issue because what these two genetic scientists said was, if we follow the pattern of identification using genetics, blood, that is followed by the United States, we could say that in Brazil, over 90% of the population is Black. If we use the same percentages that are used in the United States. So using genetics in Brazil makes no sense. And it was funny because back then, I remember there was a Black gymnast, a Black singer that had blood tests to determine their race. And both of them are more European percentages in their blood, even though they were Black. So genetic scientists said, we cannot use this classification to determine who is Black. Additionally, it is going to cause retaking racist theories that we wouldn't like to bring back. So you can see how from the 90s, these debates regarding identification started to emerge from census. The first census during slavery, to see the proportion was its purpose was to see the proportion of Black population in Brazil. They were worried because of the revolution in Haiti and what was happening in the region, but after the 40s, during the 40s, we started with the whitening policy in the population. So it was necessary to have a census. And then from the 90s, we had racial policies. We needed to improve the census to see the proportion of the population to establish the policies for this population. And we started another test in 2008 to see if we needed to keep these policies. And the conclusion was to keep the same categories of Pardo and Prieto. And then in the census of 2010, they continued with the same categories. And now they are analyzing the data from the census in 2020 because with the pandemic, Bolsonaro, it was harder to have a conclusion from that census. However, there were a lot of obstacles for this census because Bolsonaro didn't want to do it. It didn't have enough resources. And up to the year 2000, the census was not universal. And then after that, the question became universal for the whole population. Then we have the categories. Who are the pardos in Brazil? If you count the Afro population in Brazil, next slide.
The census of 2002, I never bring the numbers, but it showed that 91 million of Brazilians are white, which is 47% of the population. 82 million of people are Pardo, which represents 43% of the population. 15 million of people are Pretos, 7.6% of the population. 2 million are yellow, 817,000 are indigenous. All this discussion that I'm showing to you for Afro-descendants, there was also a discussion of how to classify the indigenous, if it had to do with self-declaration based on language, ethnical group, because in the indigenous classification, a cultural matter was included. The Black people, every time I say Black, I mean Preto plus Pardo. We have numbers in the east, the white in the south, and indigenous in the Amazonic region. I'm going to talk about the Pardo category when I talk about the affirmative actions. Why did I bring the violence data? Because this is also something very important included in the census and in the national reports. This is a fundamental matter in Brazil regarding the Black people and these classifications. These are data of the Atlas of Violence of 2000. 408,000 Black people were murdered in Brazil, 78% of the total of homicides of the whole period. Police violence, Black people, 84.1% were murdered by police officers. The Black women represent 62% of the victims of femicides and suffer 13% more harassment than white women. The question of violence, of genocide, that is one of the most important matters of the racial discussion in the country. And this is fundamental. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, this is just a graph of the figures corresponding to violence against Black people in Brazil. And I recommend you to study it later. But at least it shows the discussion. And this can lead us to an important study of micropolicies about history of a Black intellectual that talks about this type of policy. I forgot his name. Yeah, sometimes my memory fails, but this talks about the criminology in Brazil that works with the thematic of violence and Black genocide, because this is a central subject that has been measured based on the classifications made in Brazil. The people in prison, 67% of them are Black. To see how in Brazil, violence has color. That's how we say it. Violence affects especially the Black population. Next slide. What happened after the Constitution of 88? We were at the end of the military dictatorship. We were beginning the Brazilian democracy, the first presidents that were elected directly by the population. We had a new constitution replacing the constitution and the laws of the military dictatorship. And the first moment when they began to discuss the new constitution, the first demand was the action of the Black movement. It was to discuss a legislation that was anti-racist. How do we warranty in the constitution, in the legislation, to penalize racism? And in our constitution, the law punishes the racism with 5 years in prison without the right to bail. When there's a denounce of racism, then the person is condemned to jail. And in the last reform, the last legal reform, the racial injury is also penalized with jail. So the Constitution has an extremely strong law regarding the discrimination against Black people. Recently, the Supreme Court of Justice of Brazil also classified the homophobia as a crime, which was a demand of the Brazilian movement, the feminist movement, the LGBT plus community. And these were other types of discriminations that were penalized the same way the racial discrimination was penalized. So this constitution that is new in that sense. The NGOs and the Black movement. I'm going to talk more about the Black movement at another moment. In the debate of the Constitution, there was a very strong participation of the social movements of the left, the indigenous people, Black people, feminists, in a very ample manner. And there was also the discussion for Durban, and also the government of Enrique Cardoso, which had the discussion of human development, of human rights. And so from the 90s, there were reforms in this sense. There was the recognition of the plurality. In our constitution, there is no recognition of pluralism, of plurality. Brazil has been very careful. When I talked about indigenous, the Convention 169, Brazil opposed the idea of having indigenous people because the idea of people could be a risk for national sovereignty, etc. So it was always very difficult to think about autonomy and self-government in Brazil. Thinking about that is very difficult in Brazil. It's quite far from our reality. This is a moment where several organizations, you might remember what I mentioned about Mexico and the civil associations. In the meetings for the preparation of the Durban conference and to discuss the policies for people of Africa descent, there was in Brazil several NGOs, Black NGOs, Many of them were coordinated by women, organizations of Black women. And these organizations had resources, public resources, resources from organisms, and they did a very ample work for juridical assistance, for educational projects. And they did something that was very interesting, which was a mini course in order to enter the University of Brazil. To enter the University of Brazil, you have to pass a test, which is very difficult. And it happened that in Brazil, which is a country where there is one of the lowest rate of students in the universities. Universities in Brazil were always reserved for the elites and the public universities also. The public schools are not good and are for poor people. And the elite people take their children to the private schools. But the public universities are for the elites and they don't pay anything. And the poorest people study in the public universities that have poor quality. This was the reality of education in Brazil. The government of Lula made an important change in the universities of Brazil. The fees, the quotas were very important to change the universities. But what this organization started to do in Brazil was to create in the favelas and in the poorest regions to create preparation courses for the test. Since the public schools were very bad, they wanted to level up the students to enter the university. But in these mini courses, they took the advantage and they had a course of citizenship, of political participation. It was a massive movement that was very important. And through the preparation for the test, they reached those peripheral populations. It was a very beautiful movement that unfortunately, with the beginning of the affirmative actions, was eliminated. And it's unfortunate because it had a very strong potential of political organization. There were social movements for Black people, national associations of Black people, and there were also these associations or NGOs, Black NGOs that were well known, that started to act for the preparation of Durban. There were discussions, there were criticisms. The Black NGOs of Sao Paulo and Rio were occupying the space and displacing the associations of Bahia, the Association of Northeast, etc. There is a lot of debate right now. The financing of these associations, who is financing these NGOs? So there's a lot of debate in this context between what the Unified Black Movement was and the creation of these Black NGOs that are starting to be created. Next slide. I've already talked about the Constitution, but there's a federal law that is very important that I will explain in detail, which is the Statute of Racial Equality of 2010. Years after the Constitution, we have managed to have a statute of racial equality proposed by a Black senator, Pablo Pain. And this is an important framework, but it took years for it to be approved. Can we now go to two other slides? Why is it different? Why is the order different from what I have here? Well, then let's talk about the quilombos now. The Brazilian Constitution also recognizes the rights of the quilombos. This is extremely important. It's quite new in the Constitution. The first thing the Constitution brings is the National Day Against the Religious Intolerance, which was created on January 21. In the Constitution, the discrimination and the religious intolerance was made, and it was created because a candomblero in Bahia promoted by a Pentecostal evangelical group. And with this invasion, the mother of Santos, which was a lady that was quite old, uh, passed away. And it was a drama. And at that moment, Lula was the president already. And at that day, they decided to commemorate the National Day against the religious intolerance, which was already foreseen. Its condemnation was foreseen. The Constitution also recognizes the traditional property. It is the responsibility of the state to recognize the traditional properties of quilombos. But this was something that was quite complicated in Brazil. What the first law did was that to recognize that the land belongs to Quilombo, they needed to have an anthropologic study certifying that in fact there was a Quilombo of populations that had escaped from the slave era. What Lula transformed was that this had to be based on self-declaration of the Quilombos, of these lands, and not to be determined by a procedure of recognition only by the state, attesting the history of these quilombos. There is a division of who is recognized, and that is the National Institute of Agrarian Reform, the one who's going to delimit the quilombo. So in this process of bureaucracy, there are many difficulties. The certification of the lands of quilombos is very slow, but on the other hand, they have tried the topic of the quilombo together with the topic of the indigenous, the recognition of the land of the indigenous with the idea of the cultural preservation and the lands of the quilombos. So far, 2,811 certifies of recognition have been issued from the 3,471 communities of quilombos that exist in the country. Next slide. You will not be able to read it, but it is interesting to learn about what quilombos are. Well, you know, like the Palenques, they are descendants of communities formed by fugitive slaves. The Quilombo de Palmares is the most well-known one, which is in the Sierra de la Barriga between Gamboes and Pernambuco. It was a Quilombo that was there for more than 1 century. They were resistance. There were Black population. It had also indigenous. There were several populations. They escaped and they joined together several types of Black peoples. And Palmares became the symbol of the African resistance against slavery in Brazil. And on November 20th, which is known as the Day of the Black Awareness, is the date when there was a murder by a bandeirante of Sao Paulo that hunted indigenous people. The death of Zumbi de Palmares was the leader, happened that day. Zumbi de Palmares was the leader that represented the Afro struggle in Brazil. It is very difficult to talk about the quilombos in an homogeneous manner because they're quite diverse in their cultural practices. They're diverse in their compositions. There are quilombos with Afro-Indigenous people. There are quilombos mixed with white people. Among the Black population. So there are several states of Brazil, and this reflects the cultural differences in Brazil. But in general, the quilombos are settled in the idea of this African, in terms of religion, there are quilombos that are Catholic, but that they are mixed with the Santos and the Orillas. There are quilombos that are more dedicated to the Afro cults, but there's also quilombos that are evangelical. So there's a very large diversity of quilombos in Brazil. To talk about a tradition, but this idea of this history of what quilombo means. The quilombo of Palmares is known very little. We don't know what the political management was done amongst the quilombos, but this was the base of what Abdias Nascimento worked with. He worked with the quilombismo. He passed to another type of political way, another way of directing the political participation. So Palmares became like the idea of a political communitary alternative on the way in which political matters are solved. Besides this, they explored the idea of the quilombo as a Black agglomeration, and today some favelas and some urban settlements call themselves urban quilombos. These are Black agglomerations that fight for money, that fight for rights, and they are call themselves urban quilombos, and they are in the peripheries of their cities. The field of the racial studies is so wide.
What they did in Brazil, even legally, quilombos are dealt with in the framework that deals with the indigenous people because it recognizes the collective land ownership. In racial terms, they usually talk about Black populations, are usually populations related to workers that are not within the context of a quilombo. The population of quilombos is a minority when compared to the national population. Do we have time to continue? 15 minutes. I don't know if you'd like to ask any questions. So we continue tomorrow with the Black movement and affirmative actions and the Pardo classification. Okay, so we have 3 people in the room that would like to ask questions and 1 via Zoom. So I will start with a question sent via Zoom, and then I will give the floor to the 3 people that wanted to ask a question. And then tomorrow we continue because we don't have time. So first, what's the situation of the Brazilian society regarding patriarchy and that vision transcending? Because the death toll of Black women over white women must also have roots in the in the vision of patriarchy. Then to the 3 people that are going to ask questions, please talk slowly and in an articulated manner, because the audio here in the room, we have issues listening to what you say. I have 2 comments I would like to make regarding multiculturalism. First, the relation between the extreme right and the critique to multiculturalism, which could be problematic depending on the context. We could explain with the crisis of multiculturalism in a superficial way the advances of the extreme European right, but they aren't explaining right-wing groups here in Latin America. I don't know the Brazilian reality, but I lived for 4 years in Europe and working with programs in Barcelona because they call it interculturality, but in practice it continues to be multiculturalism. And I imagine in Brazil, the extreme right go through other paths that are not multiculturalism. And this takes me to the second point, talking about neoliberal multiculturalism could be a pleonasm because we have the discourse of inclusion along with phenomena that appear in this wellness state that loses its ability to domesticate political conflicts to allow the reproduction of capital. But in the French state, policies of social inclusion to were focused on the working French class. Multiculturalism is a discourse to justify policies of integration, including migration and third generation Algerians born in France, and that because of the different issues in France, they're not integrated in the society. Multiculturalism was a parallel development to what I like to call the market development. So this discourse of development didn't disappear, it just changed its format. For example, now we have sustainable development, but in practice, it was just an idea of market and state developmentalism. And as a particular anecdote in the case of the Venezuelan Constitute, it made me remember the concept of people in Brazil and the debates they had, but in our constitution, the only note it has is in the chapter of indigenous peoples, and it says that the concept of people is not the same as in international law, so it does not undermine the self-determination of indigenous people. But not only that, those who were against including the word people were not the extreme right. And when in 2007, when there was the reform of the proposal of the reform of the Constitution, the ones that in 1999 once again said we had to remove that note and also remove the word people and take their character of people away. One of the main defenders of removing it was Luis Brito Garcia. The magazine published by the Ministry of Culture, I don't remember the name. Oh yes, it was a plena voz. There was volume in which Mario Sanoja is debating what Luis Brito Garcia said because he had published an article with a new initiative to be against having the denomination of people in the Constitution. So once again, it is not only the extreme right, the ones who are discussing the place of the indigenous people in our Constitution.
Como quedan, se me ha olvidado que le estaba también en lista.
I'm sorry, I forgot he was on the list. So please, let's be brief. Good afternoon. Regarding what our colleague was saying, in Venezuela, the indigenous peoples in struggle against landowners, there's the case of Cacique Yupa Sabino Romero, that despite the recognition of its ancestral land started by Commander Chavez on indigenous peoples, he has been criminalized by authorities in the territory and the current legal framework and justice. Because of the way in which justice is implemented in that territory. Please explain the struggle for the land of the Amazonian region, the current situation and advances. Good afternoon. Yesterday I didn't say my name. I am part of the group that's following the seminar since its first edition. And in the different encounters we've had, there's been an emphasis on the impact of segmentation of population in designing public policies. That has taken us to reflect on the process of segmentation in digital environments. The fact that segmentation has an impact on designing public policies and the level of automation that requires the 2030 agenda takes us to reflect how this segmentation in digital environments has an impact on the process of self-determination and self-recognition. You referred to the color palette used in the census is reflected on the marketing of this agenda, and in the digital environments we have identified as a marketing of poverty and of the bodies self-identified as Afro. So do you believe that in digital environments, the 2030 agenda can affect the processes of self-recognition? And could something solve these asymmetries of seeing them as just goods because of how of the marketing of trends and the bodies self-recognized as Afro, with, for example, pornographic materials, and the adoption of digital identities that are part of the pornographic industry in which Afro women are affected. And finally, if tomorrow, with the basis of what you presented at the beginning, make a comment on the census, on the question that the Venezuelan census has on that self-identification, because you explained that that data establishes the policy of the state. Good afternoon, Rebecca. It's a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity, Guillermo. When you were discussing the relation between Brazil and the United States, so what do we have regarding Brazil and its relation with Africa and the Caribbean? And regarding the new categories and concepts, we have a trap because you talk about different rights. Let's make a summary of human rights. There's a mercantilization of indigenous rights, nature rights, and Afro-descendants rights. And that obligation of having those multilateral agreements with, for example, conferences, agreements signed, we as states, because our constitution of 1999, we were in a dissertation yesterday, that constitution does recognize the treaties regarding human rights according to the constitution. I think the constitution from 1961, our constitution didn't express that. How is the situation in Brazil regarding the obligation between the constitution and international treaties on human rights?
Eu vou tentar contestar. Les voy a proponer algo. Viernes, quizás
I am going to propose something. On Friday, we could use most of our time to have a discussion amongst us because I am interested in the Venezuelan aspects. We maybe could have a discussion table because it is hard to understand what you're saying from where I am. There's a lot of echo in this room. And sometimes I think, oh, I am forgetting my Spanish, but then I realized Guillermo was having the same difficulties. So I hope you are listening clearly to what I'm saying, but here in this table, we're having difficulties with the audio. There are so many issues we could explain, and sometimes I just cover it superficially. Patriarchy. I couldn't talk about that when we're talking about the Black movement, but yes, we must talk about Black feminism in Brazil. Black women are the ones leading organizations with a great struggle. The Ministry of Race Equality and many deputies are women. So there's a protagonic role of women and participation in Durban. Women had also had a protagonic role. And this movement questions and faces white feminism because white feminism does not consider the experience of Black women. They don't consider the experience of diaspora. And we see in other countries in Latin America this critic to feminism, but also these women like Carnero, they criticize the Black movement of men because they haven't given spaces to Black women and they haven't discussed domestic violence, violence against women, patriarchy. There's a debate on this topic. Constitution has advanced on women's rights. We have the law Maria da Peña, which is against violence, women violence. It is a very consolidated law against the assassination of women and domestic violence. And the police are always ready to receive these kind of denunciations. And I had slides to talk about women's participation. And Black women are part of the discussion on African traditions, African philosophy. They have a protagonic role nowadays within Black resistance, and I hope we can talk about that in the future. When I talked about census, there was a strong campaign from the Black movement called "We Will Not Let Their Color to Appear as White." So it was for people to identify themselves because it is racism what preventing them from identifying as Black.
It seems like people is not ashamed of being identified. Sometimes they accuse them of having that as a strategy, but yes, it can happen. But this to me is one of the most positive changes of the affirmative actions. And this happens thanks to the identification, happens to aesthetics, because at the end of the day, from a moment when everyone straightened their hair, today there's a valoration of this Afro aesthetic that is quite strong in the United States. And there were other important changes we didn't talk about. There was the obligation that all of the advertisement that involved public people or public companies, anything related to the public world, were forced to have Black people and white people by law. And this had a very strong impact. And today, if you turn on the TV and you watch Globo and you see the news programs, they're filled with Black journalists. This was unimaginable 10 or 15 years ago. So today we're having another reality we were not used to before, the right wing Blacks. There were always some of them, but sometimes we thought there were Black journalists, but then conservatives came. And I remember there was an association that exists in Colombia that they are Black people and they're from the right wing. It's not that there weren't right Black people in Brazil, but this wasn't assumed based on their race. Now they're assumed their race, they talk about racism, they talk about discrimination, but they're from the right wing. And there are the Black people that Bolsonaro said that they were a minority, and they are from the extreme right. But they believe that racism and all that discourse is not important, is irrelevant. But they're from the right wing. And that's terrible because it's something that is quite old, that has to do with social democracy, that Brazil didn't have racism. This is something that Bolsonaro brought to say that There was a friend of mine, a Black leader, that said that Bolsonaro wanted to say that he had a Black person to be his friend because since we attacked him as a racist, Bolsonaro tried to look for Black people to soften those accusations. There are students of mine that are Black militants that get frustrated. They say, oh no, but Black people have to fight against capitalism. And they say, I'm sorry. And you cannot tell them not to be Black, but they're from the right. They're more conservative. This is a discussion that we're going to have and we're going to have in the future. Regarding the questions, do we have to reach intersectionality? 1 week is not enough for all these topics, but we can make a criticism to intersectionality, even though we use it. When we talk about intersectionality, we say that for an analysis, we have to take into account the gender, the race, the ethnicity, the social class, but this cannot be a summation because it's not like the multiculturalism, which is a summatory of differences. I like very much the theoretical frameworks of inequalities that discuss the new theories and discuss the problem is that we have to define that inequality. Inequality have to be measured, has to be measured by including all those elements like gender, etc. And how can we work on the concept and or the measurements of inequality? Well, by integrating these specificities based on different areas. We have to leave that definition of inequality based on only one element. We are in a space where we are trying with new alternatives because sometimes it's very complicated. It's like a summatory, a summation of differences because we have gender, sexuality. We have to integrate the disabled people, the integration of the idosas populations. So in this scenario, there are laws against discrimination. In my university, for the postgraduate course in law, we have quotas for Black people, quotas for quilombos, quotas for transsexuals, quotas for disabled people, and there's one that is missing. We have different quotas, so it's a mathematics calculation. We have 50 spaces for the post-degree program. So how many spaces are we going to leave for each one of these quotas? So it's like a summation. So the differences are multiple, and we start adding them up all the time. There's a moment where we believe that I believe that we reached in Brazil thanks to the success of many of these policies. How can we work together? We need multiple demands associated to groups that are very different. And one cannot know everyone. I teach in an institute where we form diplomats, and my course has to do with diversity and anti-discrimination. And I have a lot of problems with this concept of diversity. And when we talk about affirmative actions, I'm going to say why diversity is a very complicated subject. But now in Brazil, they talk about diversity. But they asked me to talk about all those differences in the course. They didn't know anything about people with deficiencies, which is the official term in Brazil, the discussion of age. And I started reading all those differences and to understand all the political demands of the associations and everything. And I was overwhelmed because it is a world with discussions of sexuality, and the quotas, they demanded the adaptation of the public policies to all those differences. What do we separate as universal policies? What do we separate as specific policy? That is the next challenge, because this is a criticism that I have to the current policies of the new ministries, and I do it with very carefully because they continue announcing the quotas, but I wonder, do we have to have a regulation system? Do we have to start to discuss how to evaluate these policies? How do we apply them? How can we advance based on them? And not only continue determining numbers and percentages of quotas. The experience of Europe. France, for example, had what they had the French multiculturalism that is quite specific from France. They talk about that within the integration policies. There's a whole adaptation, and France had that discussion that is very present regarding the private area and the public area. The public area means that there's no difference, and the private area does have differences. But what they don't realize is that the public area is marked by a culture, by a religion, by specific values. So when France enters the discussion against the Islam, it forgets about it. France is a country that even though people are not religious, it is a country with a Catholic culture that is extremely strong, based on Catholic values. It has been like that historically. So this neutrality is, what type of neutrality do we have? But we can continue discussing about this because there are models that are very different. There's the English one, the North American one, the one from France, that are very important to know because this is what marks the differences of the colonizations. And we can talk about that at any time. The discussion about indigenous. The indigenous debate leads us to a gigantic discussion that is very different from the racial matter. Why? Because Brazil has a regime of indigenous land. This used to be like the indigenous reservations, like what Canada has. It's not that similar to the United States. It's a very different regime. And so far, up until the Constitution, the indigenous in Brazil were under the tutelage of the state. They were lands of the union of the state, and the indigenous do not own the land. These are federal lands that are with the indigenous people. This is a very specific framework of what the indigenous reservations did. And even though the Constitution took the indigenous people out of the tutelage of the state, there is a statute of the 1973 of the era of the military dictatorship, which determined the indigenous tutelage, which has not been replaced so far. There's a new statute that is being discussed that has never been voted. And even though the Constitution defends the indigenous people in a different way with autonomy, because in Brazil there's no discussion about territorial difference like in the rest of Latin America, the way in which the indigenous are considered is a very tutelar, and we have to watch that all the time. And the anthropologists as well, mainly the indigenous of the Amazonic region. The anthropologists talk for them, they don't talk for themselves. And as the quotas advances, and as the indigenous people do PhD programs, and as they enter the labor market, how difficult it becomes. This comes out of the indigenous imaginary for completely. There are many indigenous people in the cities, there are indigenous people. The Cabocla population self-identifies itself as indigenous. Before the census of the 90s, we had 300,000 indigenous people in Brazil. When it passed to self-declaration, the number rised up to 800,000. It more than doubled when we had self-declaration. So it's these indigenous people of the Northeast, like caboclos, that reassume themselves as indigenous. But they don't fit in the conception of the Amazonian indigenous people. And there's a problem of the Guaraníes in the south that have a lot of problems with the agribusiness, etc. So the indigenous question is quite wide. We have lots of difficulty when treating them, even the anthropologists. The anthropologists are always looking for the most exotic things. And at the same time, you realize that there is a multiplicity of indigenous people and indigenous demands, and this causes difficulties. And just now, there is a struggle in Brazil about the temporary framework. And if I start to explain to you what this has to do with indigenous lands and the situation of the indigenous land, it would be quite hard. Quilombos are invaded just as the indigenous lands all the time. There's violence against the quilombos, tremendous violence. In Bahia, there's a conflict with the quilombos due to the land invasion, due to the interest of the landowners or the mine owners. There's a drama. Maybe you remember the first class where I mentioned that the question of the lands in Brazil is a drama, is a fundamental problem. And I would leave the whole discussion of the impact. I took note of Brazil with respect to the Caribbean and the countries of and the environmental rights. I would leave that for the next session. And the obligation of the Constitution after the approval of the Congress, the ratification of the international agreements, they have force of law in the United States. They are recognized. They can be directly appealed in justice. They are rarely summoned, but they do have force of law. But I wrote down here all the questions because when I start talking about the statute of racial equality, these topics will arise, and I hope that I won't forget about anything. Having just 1 week to talk about the indigenous topic in Brazil, it's quite difficult because it's another world, it's another discussion. The classification, the identification, everything is quite difficult. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca, for this second class. Well, we are going to continue tomorrow at the same time, in the same place. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for the people who connected through Zoom. And thank you to the interpreters, of course.